Though it has been interrupted quite a bit, I have been trying to discuss, as part of a larger theme about creating an evangelistically focused church, or at least one in which we are able to present ourselves as a body the way that we should. As part of that discussion, we've been looking at the way that the elders interact with the church. And kind of so far, we've looked at the idea of who can or perhaps should be an elder. What are those qualifications? How does all of that work? And I really think this is one of the most important aspects of having an evangelistic church, that is the leadership and the congregation being able to work together for the greater good of the group. So much of this begins with the eldership and how the eldership works within the church. This morning, I want to get back into this discussion again with the lesson looking at the elders and how they elder, including showing some ways they probably shouldn't. Before next week, when we will switch gears a little bit, change perspective, and next week look at the way that the congregation should be working with the elders. For this morning, I want to look at the elders and how it is that elders will elder in a congregation. Good morning. It's good to be here this morning, isn't it? It's great to have this opportunity to serve together, to take the Lord's Supper together, proclaim the Lord's death together, to sing together. It's just a joy to be here together, and really appreciate this opportunity that we have to be together this morning to open up the Word of God together. We do have some who are visiting with us, and we're really glad that you are here this morning, that you have chosen to be with us, and it makes us feel pretty special. We're glad you're here and hope that you will feel encouraged by the time that you spend with us this morning. Now, I do want to do just a very brief review of things that we have talked about before concerning the words that are used for elders. Remember, there are three words that are used interchangeably in Acts chapter 20, 1 Peter chapter 5. The first one is the word elder, or maybe you've heard presbyter before. This is one of those older individuals, the picture that you find within the Old Testament, and I think carry over into New Testament times. It's the one who sits at the city gates, whether that's literal, as is the case in some narratives, or it's a figurative idea, that is, he's one of the wise ones of the city that people will come to, and they will adjudicate problems or things that need to be resolved. These are the ones that the people turn to when they seek wisdom. Wisdom that accompanies someone with age, hence the term elder or older individual. We talked about the idea of a shepherd. Perhaps you've heard the word pastor is also how this word gets translated. In fact, Dave talked about the shepherd in the class this morning, for those of you who took the opportunity to be a part of that the shepherd takes care of the flock. And the shepherd, and we're going to talk about this some more today, but the shepherd gets in and among the flock and leads the flock from the front. Doesn't push them from behind or prod them, but actually leads by example. And so this is the idea of the shepherd or the pastor. And then you have also the term overseer or bishop. This is the individual who is able to manage things within the church. But what we come to understand is it's not a matter of managing everything that has to do with the church, so much as that it is managing the spiritual matters of the church itself and the things that are the most important that the elders or the overseers are going to take care of. Again, as I said before, these are used interchangeably in a couple places. Acts chapter 20, Paul uses all three of these terms, not necessarily all as nouns, Sometimes you see it as a verb. But you also see it used interchangeably in 1 Peter chapter 5, which is where I want to spend our time this morning, looking at Peter's admonitions that are given to the elders. In 1 Peter chapter 5, starting verse 2, it says, "Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight." There's your overseer. Shepherd at the very beginning is the shepherd pastor. And we kind of skipped over where he talked about appealing to elders there in verse 1. But it says, "Shepherd the flock of God that's among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." So this passage is delivered very specifically. This section is very specifically given to the elders within the churches in northern Asia, Galatia, Cappadocia, all those regions to which Peter's writing. Peter is very specifically telling them this is the attitude that a leader in the church must take. This is the way that the shepherd should be. And the fact that Peter even has to write this demonstrates that at best, Peter understands that hypothetically, leadership within a church can be abused and maybe he needs to head it off. Perhaps more realistically, leadership within the church was already being abused. And this was written in order to make sure that these elders understood that they were not to continue with the attitude that they were taking as the leaders within the church. So Peter tells them that abusing the power that comes with the position of being an elder within the church is a gross mismanagement of that position. So let's focus in on what Peter tells them here. There's three basic things that he says. He has a pattern here, not this, but this. He does this three times. The first one, he says, "Shepherd the flock not under compulsion." Some might feel as if they have to be an elder, even though they have absolutely no desire at all to be an elder. And Peter makes it very clear that someone compelling you to do the job already makes you kind of bad at that job. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. Sometimes the very best person for a job of leadership is the one who is humble enough not to want it. And I think it's important that we understand there's a lot of wisdom to that. Someone who's free of ambition, who's not in it for the power and not in it for all of these things, who says, you know what, I'm fine behind the scenes. I don't have that ambition to be the leader. Sometimes this could be a person who has the greatest capacity to serve. But a man should never feel as if he has to serve as an elder or else. And that's actually a rather common frame of mind that's given, especially within our circles, because we have a tendency to take the checklists in 1 Timothy and the checklist in Titus, and we compare people simply up to the checklist, and we say, look, you match this, therefore you must be an elder. It's your duty. It's your responsibility to do that. And if we kind of use those checklists appropriately, as we've talked about within the last few months, as the last thing that you go through, not the very first thing that you go through, but you first find someone who's doing the job, doing the work of an elder, someone who can serve in that leadership capacity, it might take away some of these problems. You also have congregations who just simply make people feel as if they have to be an elder, that is the way that it's put out. Oftentimes it's because a congregation is facing the prospect of having no elders at all. Maybe someone has passed away, there's only one elder left, so they turn around, they look around, and they say, well, if we don't find another guy, this congregation's not going to have elders at all. And so they find a guy and say, it doesn't matter if you want the position or not. Do you want a church with no elders? Then you better step up. That's compulsion. I mean, we can see that, right? That is compelling someone to do something that they have no desire to do. And that's exactly the type of thing that Peter is saying shouldn't be done. And this scenario happens probably more often than we would think. I've known of elders in various places, men who did not want to serve, but they knew that if they didn't, the eldership would dissolve, so they stepped in and they served anyway, sometimes to the detriment of the group. Peter says this is going to put men in office that ought not to be there, typically because they just aren't qualified for that position. Typically it's not because they aren't qualified for the position. The problem is they are guilted into it. Let me suggest to you that you should be striving to get to the point, if you are a man in this congregation, you should be striving to get to the point where you can serve as an elder. You should be probably working to present yourself in such a way that you'd be able to, but you should never serve as an elder because you were guilted into doing it, under compulsion. Because as Peter goes on to say, you should do it willingly. It's a choice that you make, that you desire that opportunity to serve in this way. Again, because of humility, someone may feel as if they are wholly inadequate for the position. But that doesn't mean that their self-assessment is correct. They may feel inadequate when everyone else looks at them and says, no, you are more than adequate. You are perfect for this job. But an elder needs to be one who is willing to serve in that capacity. Peter goes on to say, not for shameful gain. And I think he's talking about monetarily here, but there are all kinds of different ways that an elder or someone within leadership could experience some type of gain. Paul tells Timothy about those who believe that godliness is the means of great gain. Again, I think he's talking financially, 1 Timothy chapter 6, and goes into this. And he says actually it is when it's accompanied by contentment. But in 1 Timothy chapter 6, I think Paul's talking about elders. The elders who are trying to get into that position because they believe they will be financially supported by the church to serve as elders, and it's kind of an easy gig. It's an easy job to do. And Paul says that's a horrible attitude to take into it. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and men who follow it have gone into all kinds of griefs and problems. See, any motive other than the service of the church and the desire to help others get to heaven might be an improper motive. And so this is the elder who serves because of what he gets out of it. It's about self-promotion. Again, probably financially, but there's all kinds of ways that an elder could try to get in that position. A man could become an elder to promote himself. And Peter says an elder should not serve as an elder if by doing so he believes that it elevates him or it benefits him in some way. Instead, he says he should serve eagerly. Now, this word is actually very close, not from the same word family, but as far as meaning goes, it's very close to the last word in definition. Willingly, eagerly, just like above, not under compulsion, but willingly. It's the same concept here. And so to understand what Peter's trying to get across with this, I think we compare it to the statement that it is coupled with not for shameful gain. And so we use that to help us understand, instead of being in this to promote himself and his own gain, he would willingly jump in here for something else. What is that? The opposite of promoting self is what? It's being there for others. It's being eager to jump in to help others, take care of others, It's the eagerness to think of others instead of himself. That means when the elder decides who is most important, it's the flock that he serves and not himself. This conjures up, I guess, pictures, you would say, of Ezekiel chapter 34. It's that great chapter in Ezekiel where he talks about the elders of Israel who were not serving as elders in Israel. They weren't taking care of the sick. They weren't helping the marginalized. They were, as it's described, when it came time to eat, pushing away everybody else so that they could get to the feed trough first. And there the Lord says that they're a whole bunch of horrible elders, and they will pay the punishment for it. An elder does not see himself as number one, but he's eager to help others that he sees as more important than himself. The attitude that Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. And then you get to the third couplet here, not domineering over those in your charge. And I think there's a reason that Peter saves this for the third, because I think he's building up to this one. This is probably, I would say, the greatest issue that occurs with leadership. And that is leadership domineering over others. This is the one that I believe that's the most important, because this is the mindset that often comes with power. You've heard the phrase that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. I think that's what Peter is talking about here. I would assume that individuals, people who find themselves domineering over the flock, probably don't begin that way. They don't start off by saying, wow, get me in that position so I can show them just how much I can pin them underneath my thumb. Probably these are good men who are elevated to this position, placed in this role of leadership, and then what happens? People, right? It's dealing with people. Maybe they might find the words that Lucy has to say familiar here. You know, I can't help thinking this world would be a better world if everyone would just listen to me, right? That's the idea. They're elevated, they're placed in this position, and then what they say is not always regarded the way that they want it to be said. They want to do things, but people push back and don't want to do the things that they would want to do. It's like George W. said, if this were a dictatorship, this would be a whole lot easier. And then he added, as long as I'm the dictator, right? You know, that's the mindset that gets into a lot of people when they have their views, they have their ideas, they know what they want to do, what they want to accomplish, the pathway is clear. The problem is that nobody else is jumping on board. What happens when an elder is asked, what should someone do? What should I do in this scenario? Well, the elder gives an answer and the person does the exact opposite. You think anything like that's ever happened before? Probably a couple times. Or what about when an eldership has to make a decision for the entire church? And that ends up being something that's controversial. And there's a whole subsection of the church that gets really upset about this decision or this path or this way of doing or thinking things. You know, in a perfect world, people would say, well, you know what? Maybe I don't have all the information. Maybe I should trust his or their judgment on this. And we'll talk about that a little more next week. But do we live in that perfect world? What happens when an eldership chooses a path for a church? Or even just discusses a course of action with an individual, and the church or that individual doesn't agree? What do you do then? By the way, we're entering into a world, and I'm sure you've realized this by now, where there are no more experts any longer. We understand that to be the case. There's no such thing as wisdom anymore, that you would go and seek it out because I can manufacture whatever information, wisdom, ideas that I need. If I don't have the answers to something, I can just whip out my phone, find whatever I want to, and not worry about, the website reads ideas that are really horrible and stupid.com and say, well, it's here on the internet, it's got to be true, right? And I become the expert on this, that, or the other, and therefore if I go to someone who should be in the expert position, they say something that doesn't agree with what I, the expert, believe, well, I can just reject that because there are no such things as experts anymore. What happens then? What recourse does an elder or an eldership have? Well, there are a few that people have tried to take. There's a great book by a guy named Lynn Anderson. It's called They Smell Like Sheep. I don't know if y'all are familiar with this book. The book is incredibly helpful for looking at the proper and improper ways of leadership among elders. And just like with any non-inspired book, you cannot simply read through this and just accept everything as if it's scripture. You have to evaluate it, consider it against the Word of God. There's a lot of information that Anderson tries to get really practical about, and he uses a lot of examples that really just aren't relevant anymore because the technology he describes has passed us by, or sometimes it's just not very good advice. But there are some gems in this book, some things that I think are very powerful and helpful, and I want to home in on what I think is particularly helpful in the ways, some of the ways that Anderson describes poor leadership. That is, observations of ways that elders might abuse the power or the position that they have. And I become indebted to Anderson here. I'm going to use his words, except I've added one of my own. But he describes leadership styles that are often attempted that just are not very biblical. He describes these as types of abuses of power, abuse of the position, ways in which people can domineer over the flock to get their way. And remember, as is often the case in sermons, what gets described are extremes. So, there are obviously nuances. Nothing that I say is a 100%. It's going to be everything. So, take them for what they're worth. We are evaluating caricatures of bad leadership. So none of these are going to fully describe a real-life scenario, which always has more going on. But I think these caricatures or these pictures are valuable to have in our head of things to look out for, particularly if we are evaluating ourselves and how we manage leading other people in and of ourselves. The first one he describes is the hired hand, elder. This is the individual that when the going gets tough, the elder gets going away somewhere else from the trouble so that he doesn't have to deal with it. This is reminiscent of John chapter 10. Again, Dave was in John chapter 10 in the class this morning. Well, in verses 12 through 14 there in John chapter 10, Jesus is describing the difference between the hired hand, the hired shepherd who's just out there for a paycheck, and when the wolf comes, he runs, as opposed to the true shepherd. Then when he sees the wolf, he protects the flock. This elder, when criticism or challenges hit, he's ready to hit the road, step down, maybe even move to avoid the problems. This isn't the answer. This might make a problem go away temporarily, but it's not a true solution. Nothing actually gets resolved. And so the hired hand method, which I think comes from John chapter 10, is not a good way to do it. He also describes some elders who demonstrate the cowboy elder mentality. This leader doesn't actually lead, because a cowboy doesn't actually lead from the front. How does a cowboy get his animals to do what he wants them to do? He gets behind them and scares them into going where he wants them to go. And if they're stubborn, he'll use prods or whips or things like that to hurt them in order to direct them in the places that he wants them to go. The cowboy does not use carrots. The cowboy uses the stick. And the force They force cows to go into places the cows are not comfortable going. But the cows go because it's easier to go into the potential discomfort in front than to face the real discomfort behind if you have to actually go one-on-one with the cowboy. Cowboys control people by fear of what you'll do if you don't listen. This is often used of elders who know that the group is not going to follow their leadership, and so they push the group to where the group doesn't want to go. They try to ram their own agendas through anyway, no matter what. These are the elders that the people do not want to be confronted by. These are the ones that if an elder comes towards them, they would rather go anywhere else than spend time with them, because these elders know the means and use the means to force people to do things. These elders might get things done, but they do so at the expense of the respect of the group and the proper relationships with the flock that they're pushing from behind. Very closely related, Lynn Anderson describes the sheriff elder. Much like the cowboy elder, this is one who pushes people and uses scare tactics to get people to do what he wants. But he doesn't use the stick so much as he uses the authority of the badge. This elder will ram people through to whatever he believes should be done. And if people aren't willing to do what he says, then he's going to come in with his gun loaded and his badge prominently displayed, and he's going to say, "Excuse me, who's the elder around here? Because I don't think it's you. I'm the one. My way or the highway." They appeal not to leadership. They appeal not to their character. They appeal only to the authority of the office. They will often remind people, you have to listen and you have to obey because I am an elder. I'm the one who has authority. In times of disagreement and controversy, which amounts to all kinds of frustration when people won't listen to the wisdom of the eldership, this type of eldership comes out in exasperation. The elder will feel the only way that I'm going to be able to get through is to remind them of their place in comparison with mine as an elder. I'm going to remind them that they need to. They are obligated to yield and listen. And this elder will be more than happy to remind them of the punishment that will come to them if they refuse to do so. Just like the last one, things might get done, but they're going to come at great cost in personal relationships and the well-being and morale of the church. Now, the next one that Anderson describes is the pop manager elder. And this one's a little bit difficult to pin down, even though I think you're going to be seeing so much more of this style. But it's one who is all about using the latest, the greatest managing tips and techniques. The problem, though, is that managing tips and techniques change frequently. And things that people did 20 years ago are going to be different now. And so this one's really difficult to try to say exactly what is mean. But I think if we were to say this is the type of individual who will find whatever means, whatever tricks or things that he can do to get people, to manipulate people, to try to get people to do what he wants, to shorten the amount of time and work that are necessary for the job of eldering. This is the individual who's going to take as many shortcuts and try to lump as much together as he can. And again, there's something to be said about being efficient, but if efficiency like that comes at a cost, like personal contact, personal involvement in people's lives, the relationships that an elder in a church should have, this is probably what's happening. And those are costs that are too great. And then the final one of Anderson's is the CEO or chairman model. Within our circles, this is probably the most common means of eldering that we've seen within the past, 50, 60, 70 years or so. This is the elder or the eldership which tries to run the church like a business, to mimic the way that CEOs or boards lead their businesses, and simply tries to run the church the same way. Fact is, the church is not a business. The church should not be run like a business. And in this scenario, everything is discussed inside closed rooms. Anyone who's not in that room has no say at all in anything that happens within the church. You have kind of just a few guys, and they just meet behind closed doors, and they only come out to tell the church, this is what you're doing, before they go back behind closed doors in order to come up with the next rule or law or statute. This stems, I think, from the idea of being an overseer as one who manages everything within the church. But again, that's not the full idea of an overseer. The church is not a business. The business model is not one that should be used for the church. And I would say people in Peter's time would have been completely unfamiliar with the practices that have come from seeing the church as a modern business as we see it today. Now, there's one more that I want to add, and this is kind of my own that I add to the list. This wasn't in this book. But let me suggest that another poor method is the helicopter elder. This stems, you've heard maybe of helicopter parenting. That is the parents who hover over their children and want to make sure that they never make mistakes, they never do anything wrong. If anything negative starts to happen, the parent is always there to step in and be the bridge between them. And the parent is the one who's always doing anything and everything, and the child never does anything. It's a style of complete, total micromanagement and hovering that keeps the child from actually living, experiencing, and growing. This would be an elder who micromanages every aspect of everything done within the church. As far as leadership goes, maybe I throw this in because on one aspect of this, this is where I see my own limitations in the leadership that I do in various ways as the evangelist, often doing things myself because maybe sometimes I don't trust others to do this or to do that and just take it on instead of allowing people the opportunity to step in and do things and to grow. Like a helicopter parent, this elder obsesses over the safety of the flock to such an extreme that growth could never happen. This elder is governed by the slippery slope fallacy. If you're not familiar with the slippery slope fallacy, that is basically saying we should do X, but if we do X, there is a chance that Y might happen down the road. And because Y might happen down the road, we could go through several stages of decisions, and Y might happen, and Y is bad. We should never do X to begin with. Maybe you've heard the idea of putting a hedge about the law and saying if you never cross the hedge, then you'll never actually violate the law itself. And this is actually a logical fallacy because there is nothing at all wrong with doing X simply because it might potentially lead to Y. X is still perfectly fine to do. And so this person, though, is so scared of what could happen if a certain decision is made or that decision is made that no decisions get made. At least no decisions that would change anything. This is an elder who's very hesitant to change because when changes are suggested, the immediate thought is not to say, what is the good that could come from this? Instead, the focus is on how someone might misconstrue things and how maybe, possibly, they could introduce some kind of error down the road. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. Elders must be absolutely prudent. They have to consider every angle. That's part of the job. It comes with the territory. But there is also a danger in being so concerned about what might happen. Scenarios that are not even directly related, but they are so concerned about the what if that nothing happens. See, all of these, I think, are ways in which elders can, if they were to follow, these various methods of eldership, they could really mess up a congregation. They could lead it to ruin. Most of them occur because the elder's thinking more about himself than he is the church. Because an elder focused on himself, his own reputation, his own way of thinking, just becomes scared of making a mistake. In fact, maybe even more scared of making a mistake, the elder might be more scared of being found to have made a mistake, more worried about his reputation than the well-being of the flock. This elder would rather push forward with a bad agenda than to admit that he was wrong about anything. And this elder could do all kinds of damage to the church. Instead of domineering over the flock, Peter says to be an example to the flock. The good leader, the good shepherd, does not lead from behind. A good leader doesn't lead from behind closed doors. The good elder leads from the front. The good elder doesn't tell people what to do. He shows people what to do, how to live, how to think, how to act, how to talk. The good elder can do that because he uses himself as an example. And yes, using ourselves as examples is valid. There's nothing wrong with saying, look at what I have done, with the proper attitude behind that. Paul does it all the time. And Paul does not do it in a way of saying, I'm an apostle, so it's okay for me to do this, but don't try it at home, kids. No, Paul uses himself as an example of how we should strive to do the same thing. Remember, he told Timothy, find men that you can teach who will then be able to teach others also. That's the way that it works. You demonstrate the pattern. Well, first, you learn the pattern, you demonstrate the pattern, and you find others and say, hey, follow my pattern as I follow Christ. It's not hubris if it's done right. It's simply allowing oneself to be an example for the flock. The best elders don't tell people how to live for God. They show how to live for God, and then they help people to live it themselves. And one of the things that I like the most about this book is the title. I mean, don't even have to buy the book to see that, right? There it is, right there. Again, I don't recommend everything that's written, and really a lot of the application I just didn't find helpful at all. But the premise of the book, fantastic. A shepherd smells like sheep because a shepherd is in and among the sheep. He is there with the sheep. He is in constant contact with the sheep. And an elder smells like sheep because the elder recognizes, as Peter does, that even if an elder is serving as a shepherd within a congregation, he is still just a sheep to the good shepherd himself. That he has a higher shepherd that he serves, and he smells like a sheep because he understands, first and foremost, that he is one as well. A good elder knows that his service to others only exists because he knows what it's like to be a lamb in a flock. Therefore, he wants the best for every lamb in his flock, the same way that Jesus wants the best for all in his. One thing that I've come to appreciate here is that we have shepherds here. And it's interesting how often I kind of find out they're involved in ways that I wasn't even aware that they were. I do believe these men smell like sheep, and strive to serve. And I'm not preaching this, by the way, at these men here in order to get them to straighten up. I'm simply going through much needed material for any church to observe and spend time with. This is actually material that I first put together for the church in St. Louis as we were preparing ourselves to ordain elders for the very first time in a very long time. So I didn't put this together in order to hammer on the group, the elders that are here. I don't think that's a problem that needs to be addressed, but I do think it is vitally important at all times for a congregation to know what does a healthy eldership look like and what does an unhealthy eldership look like, so we can always be prepared and know how to handle an eldership that perhaps has lost its way. But really, that is a discussion for next week. Next week, I'm going to shift focus from an elder's responsibility to the church to the church's responsibility to an eldership. And some important principles that we must remember when we think about the work of elders within a church. Until then, let us be thankful for the men that we have here as shepherds leading us. Let us give them the honor that is due for those who serve well. Let us be sheep that they serve, as they also smell like sheep. And let us give praise to the one true great shepherd who shows us what love looks like, who shows us what service looks like, who shows us what a shepherd looks like. The good shepherd, Jesus the Christ. Let's pray. Our great and amazing God, we thank you for the way that you have organized your church and the leadership that you have structured. Help us to always look to your word, to abide by it in the ways in which we live it out in the world. We thank you for the Good Shepherd, your Son, the one who has taught us what love is by how he loves us and laid down his life for us. We thank you for that sacrifice, which gives us the hope of heaven. We thank you for Jesus, and it is through him we now pray.